So this is Love, Chapter 14. Charles sighed, relieved when Ferdinand finally left. He had never liked the man, and since returning home from his studies, his dislike had only intensified. For the life of him, he could not understand why his father placed so much trust in the Grand Duke. Perhaps some things are meant to be mysterious, he thought wistfully, like the identity of the girl with the glass slipper. Charles balled his fists at his sides. He hated the possibility that Ferdinand might be right about the search being pointless. A quiet knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Your Highness," spoke his attendant, Pierre. "What is it?" "Your aunt, the Duchess, sir. She awaits your company in the south courtyard." Charles hadn't forgotten, but he had lost track of the time. He had been doing that often lately. "Please fetch my hat and my university jacket," he told Pierre. After a pause, he added, "On second thought, I'll bring them myself." His university jacket, as he called it, was an ill-fitting double-breasted coat he'd worn every day since away from the palace, and he loved it. It was the only garment he owned that did not have gold buttons or epaulets, or fabric so white that it looked like it'd taken an army of laundresses to press clean. It lay neatly folded on a wooden bench beside his writing desk, surrounded by two stacks of books precisely piled to obscure its location. He threaded his arm through each of the lightly frayed sleeves. To his amusement, the holes in its lining had been patched with scraps of silk, and its worn wool had been pressed and cleaned. At least he had managed to stop the seamstresses from replacing all the buttons or trying to hide the old tea and coffee stains. He'd won it from a classmate on a bet that he couldn't go 1 hour in town without being recognized as the crown prince of Aurelius. He'd made it 65 minutes before someone finally bowed. Now it was one of his most prized possessions, and he wore it whenever he wished not to be recognized, which, to be fair, was essentially all the time. Charles ignored Pierre's raised eyebrow and headed for the south courtyard. He had promised to take Aunt Genevieve for a ride through Valor's that morning, but he hadn't promised to give the tour as the crown prince. No, today he'd simply be Charles, her nephew. He had a feeling Aunt Genevieve would understand the way his father could not. That was why, when she had asked him to take her to the city, he couldn't refuse. Of all the royal coach houses, carriages, Charles commissioned the most ordinary one for the day's tour, the one he and his father took when they didn't want to draw attention on the road. It was plain as any merchant's coach, bearing no flag with his family's royal crest and no coat of arms painted on the doors. Sure enough, Aunt Genevieve was already seated inside, her tiara sparkling in the wan morning light. She waved her fan when she saw him. "You seem to have inherited your father's punctuality," she said dryly. She looked at him up and down, and the stable hand sense of fashion. "Good morning, Aunt Genevieve," the prince said. In greeting, he dared a glance at the empty seat beside her. Part of him had almost hoped she'd brought her attendant, so that he might have a second chance at meeting her. But his aunt was alone. Of course she was alone. So why had his heart skipped a beat in anticipation of possibly seeing the girl with the blue eyes again? Quickly, he recovered himself and bowed. "My apologies, Aunt Genevieve. It seems I've kept you waiting again." The Duchess clicked her tongue. "It's becoming quite the habit with you, Charles. First my welcome lunch, now this. I've half a mind to go back inside and catch up on my sleep." She waited for her threat to sink in. Before Charles could respond, she continued, "Luckily, it's a beautiful morning for a ride out into Valor's. And I'd already dismissed my girl until lunch." Charles cocked his head slightly, tempted to ask where her attendant had gone. "Come on, get inside. The sun isn't getting any younger, and neither am I." With a smile, the prince obediently entered the carriage and signaled for the driver to take off. As the coach lurched to a start, his aunt grabbed the side of her seat and snapped her fan closed. "Tell me, was it your idea to fetch me in the gourd of a coach, or your father's?" "Mine, Aunt Genevieve. I thought we might see more of the city if we weren't recognized. If you are uncomfortable, we can change into a different coach." "No." To Charles's surprise, his aunt doffed her tiara, tossing it aside. "Always scratches my head anyway. Besides, if you're going to be dressed like a commoner, I am certainly not going around looking like a duchess." Charles leaned back, hiding a smile. No wonder he'd always like his aunt. "Look at you, my boy." Genevieve patted his shoulders. "Such a strapping young man. You must have gotten your good looks from your mother. Heaven knows they weren't from George." The prince laughed in spite of himself. "I've missed you, Aunt Genevieve." "I've missed you too." The angles of her face softened as she considered her nephew. She inhaled. "Funny, I left the palace because I didn't want to live life sprung up like a puppet, and now that I'm back, I lament on not visiting more." I've missed too many years with my favorite nephew. Last I recall, Aunt, I'm your only nephew." The Duchess crossed her arms and gave him a stern look. "Much as I am fond of you, Charles, this tardiness is rather unbecoming of the future king." She raised her hand before he could explain. "I've heard from palace gossip that you're in a love-lorn state. Love sickness is no excuse for discourtesy. Do you understand?" "Yes, Aunt Genevieve, I'm sorry. Truly, it's just that I feel lost. Like I've met the one person who's meant for me, and she's vanished." At his confession, she softened further, her features melding into a smile that rounded out her cheeks and reminded him faintly of his father. "What's so special about this girl?" she asked, leaning slightly forward, her eyes taking on a mischievous sparkle. "Inquiring mind want to know. Tell me about her, Charles. You could have the hand of any lady in the kingdom, yet any lady in the world, even. Why are you so set on this one? Rather rude to take her off so suddenly." Charles hesitated, surprised by how relieved he was by his aunt's questioning. He hadn't talked about her to anyone, not about his feelings anyway. Maybe this is what he needed to help him sort out his thoughts, to get out of the haze that had clouded his mind ever since the ball. "Any other girl would only want to marry me because I'm a princess," he replied finally. She didn't even know I was the prince." At that, Genevieve wrinkled her nose. "Plenty of ladies pretend to be ignorant, Charles. It's a coy game that they play." "Not her," Charles insisted. "Not her." He tugged at one of the buttons sewn onto the tufted cushion against his back. "There was something so sincere about her, so kind. I didn't even get her name. I'm beginning to worry that she was nothing more than a dream." "Dreams don't leave behind glass slippers," said Genevieve sensibly. "For that matter, who would think to wear glass shoes, let alone to a ball?" "I told you," said the prince. "She's different." His aunt sighed. "You are hopeless, Charles. I see there's no talking you out of this, so let's talk about something else. I take it your studies went well?" "Well enough," he replied absent-mindedly. "I did find it refreshing to study philosophy, history, and diplomacy instead of protocol or dancing." While his aunt chattered on about how her husband Arthur had been a lecturer once at the Royal University, Charles gazed out the window. On his way home a week ago, he'd marveled at how little his hometown had changed. The oak trees, the wide pastures skirting the countryside, the rows of brick houses, and the estates inhabited by the minor nobles. The winding road to the palace, yet how different they seemed. He couldn't place his finger on it, but he saw more now. He noticed the people as well as the land. Surely, what he had learned during his university courses had trained his mind to be that of a learned and knowledgeable king. But there was more to ruling than that. The prince signaled for the carriage to slow down. "What is it?" asked his aunt, startled by the apparent change in plan. Charles opened the door, escorting his aunt into the town. It was still early, and no one paid him a second glance, but Genevieve was starting to get a few stares. They couldn't stay out long. "I spent almost my entire childhood behind the palace walls. Going to the university was the first time I got to see the rest of the world." "What did you see?" As they turned the corner, wending down a curved path, Charles spoke softly. "Poverty, our people, starving, orphans and beggars without anywhere to go." The prince reached into his trouser pockets and took out a gold coin. "I see it in the capital now, too. I'd never noticed before." He placed the gold coin by a sleeping mother and child, wishing he'd thought to bring food as well. But it would have to do. It was only a start. Once he gained his father's confidence, he would do more, much more. When they returned to the carriage, his aunt watched him thoughtfully. "Going away did change you. I heard rumors, Aunt Genevieve, that your husband cared deeply about improving conditions for the poor, that my father sent him away for it." "Why? Why would he do that?" "That wasn't the reason your father sent him away," said Genevieve abruptly. "I don't want to talk about it. It's better left in the past." "Forgive me, Aunt. If anyone should be seeking my forgiveness, it's Ferdinand, not you." When she wouldn't elaborate, Charles gently changed the subject. "The Grand Duke isn't exactly in my good graces either. He wants me to marry the Princess of Lourdes. I would consider it if I truly thought we were in danger of war. But I fear his real motive is to expand Aurelius's power to Lourdes." Charles continued, "My father and I should be looking to improve this country for our people, not enlarging our territory. Times are changing. While I was at school, I would slip into town occasionally, unnoticed, and observe people. How it surprised me to see them unhappy, some of them barely able to afford a roof over their heads, others begging on the streets. There were riots, too, riots against the nobility that Ferdinand denies ever happened. If the council won't address the problems arising within our own country, then I must." "What would you do about it?" said Genevieve quietly. "That is the difficult part, is it not?" confessed the prince. I'll make enemies of powerful men like the Grand Duke, and the people will dislike me by nature for being the head of the regime that oppresses them. But I want to help them, truly I do. Your father and mother were blessed to have you as a son, Genevieve said. They tried for many years to have a child, you know. 3 brothers and 2 sisters had died before him. Charles had never met any of his siblings, and the physicians had pleaded with his mother not to try for a 6th child, citing her health and her age. She had persevered, but in giving birth to Charles, her health had suffered. A familiar wave of guilt overcame Charles, and he turned to the window, sucking in a gulp of air. His aunt touched him. Your father only wants the best for you. He doesn't want you to be alone. I understand, but I just returned home. I don't know why he's such in a rush for me to marry. Genevieve hesitated. Then she drew the windows closed and lowered her voice. George plans to abdicate. The confession sent a jolt through the young prince. He blinked back his surprise. What? I've already said more than I should have. He will tell you himself when the time is right, she frowned. Best to keep this to yourself, Charles. I don't trust the Grand Duke. Lord knows what he'd do with this information. The transference of the crown always brings about a period of uncertainty and unrest. It wouldn't be above the Duke to take advantage of that and rally the lords to take more power for himself. I would dismiss him before that ever happened. It won't be that easy. Ferdinand has great influence. The nobility trust and revere him. He's a manipulator. Every time I try to tell father so, he won't believe me. You must not blame your father. Ferdinand has been his friend longer than you've been alive. 40 years of ruling Aurelius will exhaust any man, and the Grand Duke has taken advantage of that. Genevieve's expression turned grim. The point is, you must surround yourself with people you trust. I trust you, Aunt Genevieve. I'm even older than your father, she said gravely. Neither of us will be here forever. Charles perched his arm on the carriage door and looked to the horizon, punishing himself with a glance at the sun. He blinked away the sting in his eyes. You're right, but I worry that I'm not ready. I worry I'll never be ready. What does your heart tell you? I don't know. Don't know, she paused, and when she next spoke, her tone was gentler. I heard you promised to marry the girl who fit into this so-called slipper. A rather rash declaration, was it not, Charles? The prince sighed. Father and Ferdinand wrote the proclamation. I didn't have a choice. Besides, what was I supposed to do, Aunt Genevieve? Let her go? I'm not trying to lecture you, but any girl could have fit that shoe. Any girl. I wouldn't care whether she was a princess or a scullery maid, Charles said fiercely. He already knew the Grand Duke's opinion. He didn't need a second person arguing with him that the girl he'd fallen in love with could be a mere commoner. That is not what I meant. Genevieve clicked her tongue, deliberating how to explain. Fitting a glass slipper is not a sign of character or compatibility. Surely you must know every eligible maiden in the kingdom dreams of marrying you. A girl might cut off her toes simply to fit the glass slipper. Making a promise like that could have doomed you to a union with someone you didn't love, someone just pretending to be the girl you met. I see what you mean, Aunt Genevieve. Charles bowed his head. That was Father's idea, but I agreed to it. It was foolish of me. I understand that now. Love has a way of addling our wits. Genevieve tilted her head. You take after George in that regard. He was very much in love with your mother, you know. She wasn't a commoner, yet she was certainly on the diminutive end of minor nobility. My parents didn't approve of the match, but George raised all hell to be with her. I didn't know. To this day, your father is a romantic. Genevieve gave a tight smile. Funny, until then, my parents always considered me the rebellious one. Charles had heard stories about his aunt when she was young, how she once stole his father's trousers and trapezed across the royal lawn in them, an act that had distressed his grandmother so much that she nearly had a stroke, how she'd once made a slingshot out of a gold necklace and shot pearls at her tutor for suggesting she wasn't as bright as the future king. Since her last visit, her father rarely spoke of her, but when he did, it was always with a sort of bittersweet sadness. The prince didn't know what had passed between the king and his sister, and he didn't dare ask. Are you unhappy, Aunt Genevieve? Oh, no. On the contrary, I liked my husband very much. But I married him for a chance to get away from the palace and all this. She gestured to the tiara she tossed to her side. I married him for freedom, for a chance not to have my life laid out for me. Few kings and queens have had the luxury of marrying for love. You're lucky your father is giving you that chance. I know. Then The young prince's brow nodded, and he clutched the side of the carriage door. It's like she vanished completely, as if she never existed. No one knows who she is, and no one's ever seen her before. It is strange that she will not come forward, Genevieve allowed. You said she didn't know you were the prince? Charles thought back to that night, remembering how moments before she took off, she'd exclaimed that she hadn't met the prince. Yes, and she vanished soon after I tried to tell her. I'm sure she knows by now. Genevieve reopened her fan and batted it herself. Perhaps we should have another ball. Please, Aunt Genevieve, be serious. I do not usually enjoy such spectacles myself. Heaven knows they're a tremendous waste of money and time. She paused. But sometimes your father does have a spark of wisdom in him. The last ball was open to every eligible maiden in the kingdom. Do you understand the importance of that, Charles? I hadn't thought of it, he admitted. Not until recently. Ferdinand must not have been pleased about that, I can assure you. The villagers have few opportunities to mingle with nobility. Men like Ferdinand do not allow it. She let out a resigned sigh. Another ball may well be the solution. Maybe your girl will make another appearance. I doubt it. I fear she's vanished for good. People don't just vanish, said the Duchess. Mark my words. If she has any sense in her at all, she'll be at the ball. And if you have any sense in you at all, you should make sure she's the right one for you, not just because she fits a silly slipper. We'll make it a masquerade. I'm afraid I'm not following. Why a masquerade? Genevieve clasped her hands. Because, my dear nephew, even if this girl is as wonderful and kind and beautiful as you say, I would want you to be sure you're in love with her and not a pretty face. What do you say? What choice do I have? Said the prince with a sigh, but he managed to smile at his aunt. My father did always say you were wiser than he. Did he now? Genevieve said with a twinkle in her eye. That just may be the smartest thing he's ever said. I'll be sure to remind him of it. She opened the window of the carriage to wave outside at the people. Besides, your father hasn't officially welcomed me back to court. He owes me a party. Won't he be suspicious, given you hate parties, Aunt Genevieve? I wouldn't count on your father remembering that. In any case, it would be nice to be presented before the court again to remind my old enemies that I'm still well and alive. Bemused, Charles shook his head at his aunt. Then I'll do it, but only to welcome you to the kingdom. It's been so many years since I've seen you. Oh, good. It's rather gauche to suggest a ball be held in one's honor. But I'll have a word with your father. I used to be quite good at making him think my ideas were my own. You'll see. That girl of yours, she'll be there too. I'm sure of it.